everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on the charging infrastructure ecosystem. My name is Simbiat Yusuf. I'm the Member Relations Manager at Fourth, and our moderator today is Rhett Lawrence, our Policy Manager at Fourth. We have a great conversation today about infrastructure strategies from our wonderful panelists. Attendees, we ask that you please be sure to submit all your questions through the attendee chat. We will get through to them at the Q&A portion of the webinar, so keep those questions coming. The webinar slide will be shared shortly after the presentation with a few webinar recap, so do not worry if you miss anything from our speakers. We will share the recording with you all. And before we start, we like to have a brief introduction or reintroduction to FourthSuit. All of you today, Fourth is on a mission to accelerate the use of smart transportation to move goods and people. We work to advance smart transportation in four main focus areas, which are industry development, policy advocacy, demonstration project, and consumer engagement. Through our efforts, we aim to advance the adoption of clean transportation in an equitable way. For more information about Fourth, programs, case studies, or any information about Fourth, you can find that on our website at fourthmobility.org. And our membership and sponsorship is the greatest opportunity we have to make these webinars possible. We want to thank our members and the sponsors today, which are Portland General Electric, Black & Veatch, and BMW for your support today. If you want more information about membership, we have a great membership deal happening right now. Feel free to contact me, Simbiat Yusuf. My email is on your screen, simbiaty@fourthmobility.org, for great opportunities to take advantage and for more visibility options on our webinar. And if you haven't already, please register for the E-Mobility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference brought to you by Evie Noir and Fourth. This is a great conversation, a great conference, and this conference will be virtual, happening November 17th through the 18th next month. It's going to facilitate conversations. You're going to join panelists to discuss real conversations and best practices to support communities and to advance clean transportation for all. If you haven't heard, the call for papers are now open for the Roadmap Conference coming back June 29th through the 30th of 2022. So we are currently accepting panel breakout sessions, case studies that are highlighting leading developments, best practices that thank you, Crystal, for dropping that link for the E-Mobility Equity Conference. If you want more information about the Roadmap Conference, the call for papers, we will have a link in the webinar recap for the Roadmap Conference and how to register for the E-Mobility Equity Conference in the webinar recap. And I won't keep you long from the information you all signed up for today. So I will pass it along to Rhett.
Thank you, Simbiat. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Rhett Lawrence. I'm the Pacific Northwest Policy Manager at Fourth. Excited to be here with you today for what I think is going to be a really engaging conversation. I'll introduce our speakers here in a second. I first want to thank our sponsors for today, Black & Veatch, BMW, and Portland General Electric. And so we're going to have a great series of presentations today. First, this morning, we're going to hear from Dr. Matteo Muratori, who is the Chief Analyst for Sustainable Transportation at the U.S. Department of Energy and is also a Senior Engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. Matteo will be giving us a kind of macro federal view of the charging infrastructure ecosystem. Then we're going to hear from Mary Brazell, who is the Transportation Electrification Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation's Climate Office. Mary will be filling us in on some of the state-specific information on an extensive TE infrastructure study done here in Oregon. And then finally, we're going to hear from Chris Remmer, who is the Infrastructure Strategy Lead at CENEX in the Energy Systems and Infrastructure Department. And Chris is going to give us a more global perspective on policies for a mature and equitable EV charging ecosystem. And then we'll have some time at the end, we hope, to answer some of your questions as well. But first, we'd like to do a fun little icebreaker for our panelists. So I'd ask all of our panelists to turn their webcams on now. Thank you all. Great to see you today. So our icebreaker this morning is if you could be any type of EV charger, what would you be and why? And I'll start and then kick it over to you all. I mean, I guess for me, I'm still fairly new to this stuff. Still feel like I'm learning every day. So I'm gonna say I'm a level 1 charger, just your basic charger, still sort of getting up to speed. Slow and steady, but hope to advance to a supercharger at some point. So I will hand it over to you, Chris. What do you think?
Well, good morning to those folks in North America, and good evening to anyone joining from Europe. This is definitely the most difficult question I've been asked all week, but I think I might be one of those innovative pop-up charge points that comes through the pavement or sidewalk. A little bit creative, trying to break the rules, but if you push on it, a bit wobbly, still a little bit to learn, and trying to find my place in the ecosystem.
All right, how about you, Mary?
Rhett, I also want to be a level 1 EV charger, but because today it's ubiquitous and convenient and enables everybody to charge up easily, as easily as fueling with gasoline and at a lower cost.
Great, thanks, Mary. Okay, Matteo, what do you think?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I was going to give the same answer, but I also think the EV charging system needs to be heterogeneous. We do need a lot of different chargers. So you pick level 1, level 2. I'm going to pick the fast chargers because someone else did. Mostly, I do think we need all of them. So my favorite charger is a different one every day or every trip, depending on what the need is.
Great, thanks so much, Matteo. Okay, thanks. That was fun. Thanks to all of you. I think you can turn your webcams off now. We want to start this morning with a couple of poll questions to get a sense from all of you who are tuning in today. Some of the issues that you're paying attention to. So, Symbiote, do you want to queue up that first poll question for us? So yeah, jump on in, folks. Okay, I got some interesting numbers there. Just over half folks still driving a gas-powered car, but unsurprisingly for this audience, a good number of EVs or plug-in hybrids. So, okay, thanks for that. Okay, second poll question, Simbi. Okay, kind of all glad to see not that many folks concerned about range anymore. So kind of evenly split between cost, availability of vehicles, and lack of charging. Okay, and then final question. Okay, seeing a pretty strong leaning toward more public and MUD charging, sort of unsurprisingly, and more corridor and rural charging. And that clearly we need it all. Okay, thanks. Thank you for pulling those polls for us, Simbi. Great. Well, thank you all for pitching in on that. And now I am going to turn it over to Matteo to give us his perspectives on the sort of federal scene. So off to you, Matteo.
Thank you, Rhett. Can you confirm that you can hear me well?
I can.
Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for those of you tuning in from Europe, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to going back to these events and conferences in person, but this is a tremendous opportunity to talk about a very important topic, which is the charging infrastructure ecosystem. So thanks to Ford for organizing and to the sponsor who made this possible today. So transportation is the largest source of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions in the country. You see that pie there on the right-hand side that breaks it down by sector. When we sum it all up, it's about 33% of greenhouse gas emissions in the country that do come from transportation. And transportation, the way that we provide mobility for goods and for people today also impacts air quality. There are significant pollution issues that are associated with internal combustion engines. It's also the second largest expenditures for houses after housing itself. So transportation is really a sector where there is a lot of work to do to move towards sustainability. When we look at this breakdown, I think it's pretty clear. This administration has set forward a very ambitious goal of achieving a net zero emission economy by 2050. And to achieve that goal, we are going to have to significantly curb and reduce transportation emission. It's a critical element. It's a critical piece of the puzzle to achieve our goals. When you look at the breakdown within transportation, you also notice a lot of interesting things. You see those slices on the far right side: the passenger cars, the light trucks, off-road vehicles, rail, water, aviation. Transportation is not a monolithic block. And while today over 95% of the energy that we use in transportation comes from petroleum, so fundamentally we rely on a single fuel, what we see is that to decarbonize transportation and to find solutions for all these different elements and applications, we're going to need a lot of different solutions. So we think electrification is going to play a key role. We think we're going to need a lot of clean, low carbon fuels like hydrogen, like sustainable biofuels, like e-fuels. It's going to be a combination of different technologies and needs. So today I'll focus on the charging infrastructure, the charging system for electric vehicles that we think is going to play a key role. But don't forget, transportation is more than just on-road vehicles, right? There are other applications that also need other technologies. We are currently working on all of these aspects and all of these topics at the Department of Energy. We're really actively pursuing research and development, as well as deployment in all of these aspects to support tackling the climate crisis. What are we doing in light-duty vehicles, especially, and when we think about the charging needs? Well, the president a couple of months ago now, in August, released an executive order calling for 50% of all new passenger cars and light trucks sold in 2030 to be zero-emission vehicles. If you go back just a few years ago, I remember a discussion just 5 or 6 years ago on whether we could even achieve 5 or 10% adoption of electric vehicles. And now you see a very significant change, a really change of pace in the ambition and the level of adoption that we can see is going to happen over the next decades. So 50% by 9 years from now, a very rapid increase in adoption compared to what we have today. I know we have a very well-educated crowd here on EVs and a very high level of EV ownership based on our question at the beginning of the webinar, but that's still a long way to go and a lot of work that we are putting forward there to achieve this objective. A lot of pieces are needed to achieve such a goal, but charging, as again we saw in our second question, is a critical element. I think I want to share a couple of just perspective and high-level points on what is an EV charging ecosystem. What does EV charging infrastructure mean? In our mind, charging electric vehicles includes a lot more options than what we are used to today with gasoline vehicles. So today, our only fueling option is really going to a gas station and wait those 5 minutes or so until our tank is refueled. Well, for electric vehicles, the picture is very different. We have a lot more opportunities to charge. This is a figure called the charging pyramid that was put forward by the National Research Council a few years ago. And you see there at the very bottom of the pyramid, the base, the foundation on which we think EV is going to be charged is home charging. Most of EV vehicles today have access to home charging. Vehicle on average are driven less than 30 miles a day. Slow, level 1, level 2 home charging can provide a very effective way of charging EVs that is convenient to users. That's a key aspect for us, is convenience and making sure that charging EVs is accessible for users and is not an inconvenience. Right? I don't want to have to spend extra time charging. We see the next biggest opportunity in workplace charging. And then the tip of the pyramid is public charging, which includes both level 2 as well as fast charging. In this pyramid, we see some critical gaps that needs to be filled that we are working on. Intercity trips, small number of trips, but critically important. We need to provide that network of extreme fast chargers along highways. We also need to develop solutions for people without home charging, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as providing convenient access to everyone, including residents of underserved communities. And of course, we need to reduce cost of charging throughout all of these applications. This is just a snapshot of where we are today. This is a network of public chargers, so this is what is publicly accessible. It doesn't include chargers at homes and workplaces, but you see over 100,000 chargers that are available today in the country. You see there the breakdown between DC fast chargers and level 2, and the administration has put forward plans to add 500,000 chargers to this network. And so a very significant push for increasing charging availability for everyone. And so I was mentioning earlier, the foundation of the charging pyramid is home charging, is the most convenient way to charge vehicles. But how do we think about how home charging is going to evolve as the market for EVs also evolves? So this is fresh off the press, is a report that was published by NREL just a couple of weeks ago, maybe even last week, that talks about how many people have access to home charging and what is the home charging potential. So I just wanted to flag this as an interesting read and maybe summarize a couple of key points. You know, as the adoption of EV progresses, we expect residential charging access to decrease as a share in a relative share and become more uncertain over time. Again, today most EVs have access to home charging. That's probably going to change over time and it's going to reduce. So it's critical to fill this gap and provide residential access among residents in multi-unit properties, multi-unit dwellings, as well as single-family homes. You know, having a single-family home doesn't necessarily mean having access to a residential charger. And we need to fill the gap. We need to make sure that as many people as possible can conveniently charge their vehicles at home. We also want to highlight how, you know, EV charging is not just light-duty vehicles. Medium and heavy-duty vehicles are also responsible for a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions. They are a great source of local air pollutants, and we see great opportunities to adopt battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles to solve this problem. Both vehicles will need infrastructure, and you know, again, the needs are going to be different. The charging solutions are going to be different, but we think they're absolutely critical and important. When it comes to battery electric vehicle, I think there is a good parallel between LDV and medium and heavy duty vehicles. Home charging is in a way depot charging or charging at warehouses or a yard where vehicles are parked overnight, and so it can happen at a lower power level, so slower charging. And then there is a need for fast charging along highway as quickly as possible during long distance trips for light duty vehicle and during long trip for these trucks. And so we are really investing in infrastructure to provide charging solution for all vehicle types and for all consumers. Before concluding here, I just wanted to mention, you know, it's critically for us to think through charging infrastructure in an integrated way with the power grid. So ultimately, the power to charge these vehicles is going to come from the grid. We have done a lot of work to understand how EV charging might impact the grid, and we found that we expect sufficient energy generation and generation capacity to be available to support large-scale EV adoption, and we really see a lot of synergies and opportunities to exploit electric vehicle charging to support the planning and the operation of the grid itself. Electric vehicles are the largest load growth opportunity for the grid, and we really see a good synergies between EVs and renewables and using managed charging to support the grid. So a lot of exciting opportunities there. I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion, and thanks for tuning in today.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Great stuff, and look forward to talking to you more in the Q&A section at the end too. Okay, great. Mary Brazell will now talk to us about some Oregon work. So if you could turn your webcam on and join us, Mary. Great, thanks.
Great. Well, good morning. It's great to share our work today, and thank you to Fourth and my colleagues on the panel for providing a really great opportunity to discuss this. I'm Mary Brazell. I'm the project manager at Oregon's Climate Office in the Department of Transportation, Oregon Department of Transportation, and I was the project manager on the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, which we call TINA for short, because it's way too many words. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context for Oregon. So transportation electrification, among its many benefits, is essential for helping to achieve Oregon's climate goals. About 40% of Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. The Oregon Department of Transportation conducted a statewide transportation strategy that lays out our path for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state through strategies such as supporting more low carbon ways for people to travel, like biking and walking, electric scooters, or transit. But our goals stretch out to 2050, and the chart in the middle shows that today's trends and policies, which is the light green line on the top, will help reduce emissions, but fall far short of Oregon's 2050 goals, the dark green line on the bottom. So the colored boxes on the right show where we need to work to close that gap, and we found that the best way to do this is with a mix of policies. But the most significant thing we need to do is to address vehicles and fuels by going electric and making every mile driven cleaner. The TINA study looks at the charging needs for light-duty vehicles, such as cars, trucks, and SUVs, to meet Oregon's statutory goals, which are shown in this slide to ramp up from 50,000 vehicles in 2020 to 2.5 million ZEVs in 15 years. Oregon has a goal of 90% of new light-duty vehicles purchases to be ZEVs by 2035. TINA also considers the charging needs of medium and heavy-duty vehicles, such as transit and school buses, delivery trucks, and long-haul trucking, as well as electric micromobility, such as e-scooters and e-bikes. The study pays particular attention to rural and underserved communities. And in this work, we identified the scale and rate of needed EV infrastructure expansion, priority locations and types, challenges and opportunities, and the policies and implementation actions that are needed to get us there. So just a little bit of a picture of where we are. Our consultant team, which was Kittleson and Associates, Rocky Mountain Institute, HDR, and Fourth, started by looking at existing conditions in Oregon and compared this to other leading EV states. And to no one's surprise, we found that light-duty EVs and the public charging infrastructure are concentrated in major cities along Oregon's Interstate 5, in the Willamette Valley, and along the coast, revealing major gaps in rural parts of the state. Our team used scenario analysis and input from 12 stakeholder listening sessions or focus groups, exploring the electric vehicle charging infrastructure needs of 9 different use cases to forecast ZEV adoption in 2025, 2030, and 2035, and determine when, where, and what chargers are needed to support this exponential growth. And I thought you might find it interesting to see sort of the common themes that came from all of the different listening sessions. First is there's a high upfront cost of EVs and charging infrastructure. That's still the perception and concern. It's hard to find a way to charge if you live in an apartment complex. Everyone wants robust, statewide, reliable network of EV chargers along highways. The public charging user experience needs to be consistent, reliable, easy to use, open to all, and offer transparent and easy to understand pricing to make it as easy as buying gasoline. And it's still hard to find the right kind of EV to meet your needs. So our modeling results show that an expansive deployment of EV charging infrastructure will be critical to provide Oregonians with the confidence that EV charging is as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline. Across all sectors, there's an extraordinary need for charging infrastructure growth, not only by 2035, but by a fivefold increase is needed over the next 5 years. And public charging needs for urban, rural, and corridor light-duty vehicle use cases are an order of magnitude greater than all other use cases. They're shown in the right there. Home charging is still critical as well, but we also found that we assume 90% of EVs are charged at home basis today, but that will decrease to about 60% by 2035, reflecting the increasing adoption of ZEVs by residents of apartments and townhomes, and their need to rely on level 2 workplace and community DC fast charging. Today in Oregon, about a quarter of Oregon households live in multi-unit dwellings or multifamily housing. So our key takeaways. Today, there are more rural and, more public charging is found in urban areas where more EV drivers live, and in the western part of the state, yielding rural charging deserts. There are also urban charging deserts, because those living in apartments and townhomes may not have access to a parking space, let alone a way to plug in an electric vehicle. To achieve equitable charging access for all Oregonians, infrastructure investment needs to focus on low-income, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and rural communities. And we found that the private sector EV charging companies are hesitant to install charging in certain urban neighborhoods and along certain rural corridors in communities where fewer EVs are today. And so public sector investment is going to be critical to address rural and equity concerns. The contemporary studies suggest that EV charging infrastructure needs to be in place 2 or more years prior to EV adoption to address range anxiety and persuade people that the charging will be as easy as filling up with gasoline. And it's going to take a village, especially working with utilities, to get this infrastructure in place. So we came up with an overall vision to provide Oregonians with confidence that EV charging will be as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline. And we identified 6 key goals for focused attention: rapid deployment of EV charging infrastructure, equitable access, especially ensuring a rural and geographic balance, as well as strategies for supporting those living in multifamily housing, making charging user-friendly, convenient, standardized, and safe, ensuring that all benefit from the low electric fuel costs, heightening utility engagement statewide, and ensuring that foundational policies are in place, such as policies addressing workforce development, building codes and ordinances, and removing barriers to electric micromobility. Our near-term priority actions and policy initiatives are to develop this ZEV infrastructure deployment strategy, honing in on specific targets and strategies to help guide private sector investment and public sector incentives. We're going to be targeting equity to ensure those receiving income qualified rebates have access to charging infrastructure, that we can focus on workplace charging, especially for women and minority-owned businesses and frontline workers, and to incentivize investments in rural charging deserts and urban too, and get federal funding. We're going to try to update Oregon's building codes and parking ordinances to make things EV ready. And we hope to develop and fund a statewide educational and technical assistance program to provide technical resources, proactive outreach, and serve as an initial point of contact for those looking to put in charging infrastructure. And we want to lead by example, installing charging in state buildings and offices for employees as well as visitors. But we've got a long way to go. So our next steps, again, are our EV charging infrastructure deployment, and we're going to try really hard to get funding. The Oregon Department of Transportation is funding and standing up a community EV charging grant incentive program to help ensure that rural and historically underserved gain greater access to charging. We also have been pursuing federal funding already by going after a RAISE grant, and we're supporting others who have been applying to the U.S. Department of Energy and US DOT. And we are very actively planning for what to do should the federal infrastructure bill and reconciliation bill create opportunities. We're going to continue to pursue the vision created in this TINA study by coordinating with utilities, state agencies, and other stakeholders, and pushing the state to lead by example. And we're undertaking 3 supplemental analyses: hydrogen refueling infrastructure, we're looking at barriers to micromobility, and we're going to be trying to make our TINA study tools more user-friendly for planners. And really, whoops, I got the wrong one there. So here's my contact information, and ODOT's collaborating with others in the public sector, the private sector, and nonprofits to build education and awareness of EVs, develop and communicate incentives, encourage and plan for EV charging infrastructure, and identify policies to speed adoption and eliminate roadblocks to an EV future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Great information. It was great to be part of the team working on that TINA study with you. So thank you for all that great information. Now we will kick it over to Chris Rimmer to give us his global perspective. So take it away, Chris.
Hello again, and thank you for joining us today. It's been really interesting to hear my co-presenters talk about Oregon and the US, and now to the world, a slightly wider perspective. I'm here representing the GSMP, that is the Global Sustainable Mobility Partnership, of which Forth is a founding member along with my organisation CENEX. We're kind of the fourth of the UK. And we were asked by the International Council on Clean Transportation, who are the Secretariat for the Zero Emission Vehicle Alliance, to look at policies towards a mature, equitable and flourishing EV charging ecosystem. Now, the report itself is going to be released on November 1st. And so over the next few minutes, I just wanted to give you some of the highlights, and hopefully you can take a chance to look at the slides as they are circulated afterwards. We wanted to look at users, different kinds of chargers and how that they serve the zero emission vehicle market across the world, how to tackle equitability, which has already come up in the 2 presentations before, what about financial viability, and also diving into the topic of commercial vehicles. So firstly, maturity. From a user perspective, the most mature EV charging ecosystems match user segments with charging locations and serve them with the right number and type of chargers. And this is what we found as we looked across the US, the UK, Europe, India, and South Africa, that there are certain private and public types of charging locations, and those serve particular segments. So of course, private residential serves private vehicles, but there might be public travel corridors serving fleets, staff, rural users, and long-haul users. And those segments are then served best by certain kinds of charger types. And a note for those of you in the US, we've used an international vocabulary here: slow, standard, fast, rapid, ultra rapid, but hopefully you can relate to level 1, 2, and above on the right-hand side. And so we want to see a mature ecosystem that matches users, locations, and charger types. Behind the scenes, through the works of the likes of Matteo and his colleagues, maturity is supported by common factors, specifically a government focus, some sort of dedicated brief, a published public infrastructure strategy, targets that can flexibly adapt to local nuances, not simply just number of vehicles per population, but also able to get down to charger numbers, types, standards, and availability, and formal consumer representation to ensure advocacy and drivers' voices are heard. You can see on the right-hand side here some examples that we've collected from around the world. It seems to us that these 4 common factors are present where we see a mature charging ecosystem. But what about making that mature ecosystem flourish? We ran a series of stakeholder workshops, and my colleagues over at Fourth did one in North America, where we asked what were the key barriers that are stopping those more mature ecosystems from really flourishing. And you can see here the reliability of public chargers or the unreliability of those chargers. Interoperability, lack of coordinated policy between different levels of federal, state government, or in the UK we have different tiers of government. Electricity network constraints, and of course the poor business case, particularly for public charging. These came up as barriers, and we started to collect together and distill certain policy targets which could start to address these. For countries which are not in the Zero Emission Vehicle Alliance, we're recommending that these points are formulated into a policy agenda, and of course many of those that are already maturing are starting to address these. We also did a bit of work looking at the business case. And here we analysed the business case for public charging in the US, in the UK, and in Netherlands, and looked at different kinds of operating models. We've characterised them as a kind of own and operate, where everything is done by one organisation, a subcontracted external operator, maybe where land is leased to allow someone to come in and present charging infrastructure, or a concession model. And we found that these match most effectively with different charging locations. So the concession model particularly lends itself to travel corridors, the lease model particularly to hub locations. And then we went through a net present value and NPV analysis, looking to see what were the key factors and sensitivities around the business case. And of course, to flourish, you need a strong business case. We found that the business case model improves with charging power. So the higher the power, the better the business case. But the value to the landowner diminishes if that is delivered through, say, a lease or an operating model. If you look at the kind of factors that go into the business case, tariff levels have the strongest impact. If you put the prices to the users up, then it really suits the business case and it makes it much more positive. Electricity costs and number of charging sessions were the next most sensitive factors. But interestingly, just deploying more chargers had the least greatest impact on improving the business case. Well, if we have a mature ecosystem from a user perspective, supported by policy, flourishing with further policy initiatives to overcome barriers, and of course, good business case for charging. The question is, though, how can we do that in an equitable way? And this picks up a theme that I think has run throughout the presentations. We could, of course, put the tariffs up, but that doesn't serve best the historically underserved communities that many chargers need to be in. Without public intervention, then chargers tend to be deployed in more affluent areas. And so we're recommending an equity-focused approach. This might be more difficult in the short term for Mary and her colleagues or for other public authorities, but it yields better outcomes and opportunities in the long term. And here we can see a number of potential equity measures put forward by another report that we're drawing on. Two priority areas were highlighted. The first being private residential charging. Here, for those that cannot charge off the street next to their garage, will need finance. They will need information. They will need EV readiness where those buildings and facilities are built new. And there will need to be careful location of hubs so that if they need to go out to charge, that they have access to those. And of course, particularly in the historically underserved areas, this needs to be aligned really well with existing community support programs. But equally, as we looked across the world, we thought that rural locations need particular focus. If you go to South Africa or you go to India, the rural locations are between those major urban centres where the charging infrastructure is being built up. And the question is how those rural users with those particular needs, maybe utility vehicles and other more rugged vehicles, can charge. And so here, having a more streamlined installation process, carefully locating those travel corridor hubs to serve local communities and co-locating them with amenities are seen to be helpful ways to ensure flourishing is done in an equitable manner. Finally, we looked at how this might apply to commercial vehicles, typically a less mature sector. We know that even in the States, in the UK and in Norway as the sort of leading markets for electric vehicles, there's still a lot of work to be done. And here it seems that the barriers go a little further up the supply chain. There is much lower confidence in uptake. And so policies need to be set to signal the market more strongly about the decarbonisation of these commercial vehicles, because their users are more sensitive to economics and operational barriers. There's uncertainty in charging technology. Our focus looked particularly at electrification, but of course the case for hydrogen comes up here. And if you do pick electrification, is it going to be wired or wireless, static wireless or dynamic wireless, maybe catenary with a pantograph? There are many options, and so bringing those more to bear for the potential role of each of those solutions will give confidence. And as is common with the smaller, lighter vehicles, the cost of infrastructure, the electricity network constraints, and the lack of coordination of that were seen as barriers, and we've made some recommendations. Particularly interesting here is the new hidden costs. We are suggesting a consideration of promoting a parallel commercial vehicle charging network. I know in the west coast of the States there is already some dedicated heavy vehicle charging forecourts that are opening. But where you have smaller vehicles that can co-use with cars and passenger vehicles and taxis, you might end up with queues, which leads to downtime, which leads to hidden costs just because you've electrified. So maybe a case there for a parallel charging network. And we're recommending then that these are added as commercial vehicle specific streams to the policy agenda noted before. So I'd be very interested in the chat. Perhaps some of these policies have piqued your interest. Be interested to hear which policies are needed where you are to deliver a mature, flourishing and equitable ecosystem. The full report will be available on November 1st in international digital release and in a physical event that we're setting up in Glasgow at COP26. Been very grateful to be able to present some of the highlights, and I hope that you get to engage with the report when it's released. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, great stuff. Excited to see that report when it comes out, and glad our team has had a chance to work with you some. And so I would ask, we got a bunch of interesting questions coming in through the chat, of course. So I would ask you all, I see Matteo and Chris back on video. Mary, if you want to jump back on as well. We'll try to get through as many of these questions as we can. And then, yeah, any of the ones we're not able to get to today during the webinar, we'll try to get answered from these smart folks afterwards. So I'll just kick it off with just sort of a general first question, and this is a kind of broad and perhaps unanswerable one, but from where you all sit, if you could fix one specific thing about charging infrastructure, what would it be? And so maybe I will start with Matteo to see what you've got to say, and we'll just sort of go in order that you presented today.
Sure. I think there is one key important aspect, which is the way, the attitude that we look at charging infrastructure. I think that needs to change. So today we take a trip to go to a gasoline station, and I think it's a mistake to try and replicate that model. I think we really need to think through how do we make EV charging more convenient. And so if I can give you an example, it's not thinking to make sure that there is a restaurant or a fast food close to an EV charging station, but it is making sure that the EV charging station is close to a place where I'm parking anyway. I think the goal is to ensure that as much charging as possible is done when people do their own everyday life activity. And EV charging takes zero time. Like I'm shopping, I'm sleeping, I'm working, I'm hitting the gym, I'm watching a movie, whatever I'm doing, my vehicle charges. I don't even have to worry about that. That to me is the way forward.
Thanks, Matteo. It's, Mary, you want to go next?
Sure. So I would try and fix the pricing and payment challenge. Even though we would all like to be able to just recharge at home, lots of people are not going to be able to recharge at home and are going to be needing to rely on public charging. And it's sort of a nightmare right now with access. Increasingly, some companies are wanting to have access via apps. We've kind of shifted from RFID cards to apps. And And the pricing, because of demand charges for the DC fast chargers and public charging, can make the cost of electricity to fill up. It can eliminate all the benefits of low electric fuel costs. So those two aspects are the things that I would try and fix.
Great, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to Mary, actually. So, Mary, you've stolen my idea there. In the UK and in certain European countries, the sales tax, the value added tax on electricity delivered through private charging is considerably lower through your domestic tariff than it is in public charging. So, for example, in Greece, you pay 6% if you charge off your own house. If you charge out in public in a car park, you pay 24%. In the UK, it's 5% and 20%. So that was where my head was going. But I think you stole that, Mary. So I'm desperately trying to think if I could add a second thing. But maybe we can move on to another question and I'll see if I come up with something later.
Well, I'll throw in my second, and that is just solving the multi-family dwelling challenge.
Great, thank you all. All right, well, let's try to get to some of these questions that have come up in the chat. Some of them have been sort of addressed in the chat already, but there was some conversation in there about the general sort of impacts on EVs, on sort of electricity bills for a household. And then there was also some questions about, what is the future of being able to use your electric vehicle for storage, sort of battery storage for solar. So I don't know if any of you want to address that one. Who wants to start?
I can take the first one, if that's okay, Rhett.
Yeah.
And I hate to answer a question with "it depends," and so maybe I'll throw out an approximate number. So when we look at how much energy is going to be needed to recharge an EV compared to how much energy is used by a household in the United States, on average, is about a 30% increase in electricity usage. This is how much electricity you use. Now let me articulate on the "it depends." Of course, I think we all understand different households are different. You might have a big house, you might have a small apartment, you use a vastly different amount of electricity. But vehicles are also vastly different. So US households tend to have a primary vehicle and then a number of secondary or tertiary or follow-on vehicles that are used a lot less. On average, the primary vehicle is driven twice as much as all the other vehicles. And so, of course, if your primary vehicle is an EV, you're putting twice as many miles on it, you use twice as much electricity. There is also a big difference between a compact car and a big SUV or a pickup truck. And there is also a big difference depending on whether you use air conditioning and you live in Arizona or you live in a more temperature moderate place. So keep this as a big average. It varies a lot. I also think it's important to make a distinction between how much energy is used and how much is that going to cost. I don't want people to make the mistake of say, well, so that's 30%. Let me take my electricity bill and increase it by 30%. That's not really accurate. There are a lot of fixed costs that are included in your bill, and just a smaller portion of your total cost is associated with how much energy you actually consume that month. So whether you add an EV or you add any other electricity usage to your household, the fixed costs are not going to change. And so don't make the mistake of just increasing your bill by 30%. And finally, and then I'll stop there. But keep in mind that EV charging is really flexible. We drive less than 30 miles a day on average, so we can choose when to charge, and this is done automatically. So you don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. or at 3 a.m. and plug in your vehicle. There is an automated system that does it for you, and you can really leverage cheaper electricity prices that often happens to be in the middle of the night in most of the US. So the cost per kilowatt hour to charge an EV might be significantly lower than what you experience for your other appliances or uses. So keep that in mind as well.
Great, thank you so much, Matteo. Anyone else have anything to say on the sort of household expenses? I think Chris might have some thoughts on the Vehicletogrid and sort of battery storage side of the question.
Yeah, just conscious of time, but I'm involved in the world's largest vehicle-to-grid project here in the UK, and it presents a really interesting way to use electric vehicles as a storage asset. It's a very helpful and promising concept. Since the vehicle is stationary for probably 95% of its life, why not use the battery then? Already the asset is amortized and depreciated against its value as a transport asset. The challenge comes, and I see this as being picked up in the attendee chat. Currently, not all vehicles can do vehicle to grid. It's restricted particularly to Nissan vehicles. Maybe by 2024, Charin and CCS will catch up. Secondly, there's not always a good market mechanism to value that energy. So whilst it might be interesting and helpful, gaining financial benefit from it is very, very difficult. And thirdly, the charging hardware itself is extremely expensive. And so until it moves from DC to AC, then I think we'll still see that it is prohibitively expensive for commercialization. But it's coming along and certainly something to watch.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. There were also a number of questions in the chat about sort of the interplay between building codes. And at first, I think it was addressed to you, Mary, a question of whether Oregon state agencies have begun to address building codes in relation to EV infrastructure. So I'm curious, what your response is there, and then if Chris or Matteo have thoughts on sort of the interplay between building codes and EV infrastructure.
So, so the short version is, in my personal opinion, I think building codes and ordinances, parking ordinances, sort of in the long run, are the way to solve the multifamily housing challenge. That we need to have that addressed over time. It will take a long time, but it will make a lot of inroads there. In Oregon, we just recently adopted this summer a bill, House Bill 2180. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rhett. That sets a standard for 20% of parking spaces to basically be EV ready, so conduit and electrical capacity in new commercial buildings, but importantly enables municipalities to go beyond that 20% target to be more stringent. In Oregon, this sort of the state policies have sort of trumped local jurisdictions' ability to be more aggressive. So that's a hopeful sign, but that's not anywhere near enough. I think that's it. Was there another part to the question that I haven't addressed? Or is that?
No, that's great. Matteo, Chris, any thoughts on building codes beyond what Mary has said?
Maybe I'll add one small thing. We agree it's critically important, and it's also important to keep in mind timelines here, right? And so we know that charging access is not ubiquitously available, and I would also point people to the annual report I was referring to. Not every single family house really provides charging access to EVs. So it's not just multi-unit dwellings, right? It's a lot of households that would need to make changes to charge their vehicles. And if we think that we want to achieve our 2050 goal of a fully decarbonized economy, we want most of our vehicles, if not all our vehicles, on the road to be electric at that point. We have 3 decades, and so I think that speaks to the urgency of the topic. Buildings don't get renovated very often, so it takes decades for the stock of buildings to be updated. We need action now. We need today to make sure that everything new that we build and all the improvements that are made to buildings keep EVs in mind. EVs are coming. We need to find solutions to charge them, and charging them at home is the most convenient way. So as much as we can do in that space, I think everyone stands to benefit, including the electricity grid. It's a lot easier to provide power at a lower charging level where there is a lot of flexibility for EVs to charge, as opposed to extreme fast charging that might be needed, and we can support that, but we can try and minimize the stress on the grid as much as possible.
Yeah, I'd like to just add on to that and just say that I'm increasingly a fan of level 1 charging capability, just electrical 110 to 120 electrical outlets for the multifamily housing issues, and even in single family homes, trying to, with newer vehicles that have longer range, and if you have a plethora of public charging options out there, or charging at work, you shouldn't have to have a level 2 at home, and you don't necessarily need to have DC fast chargers right around the corner if you can have a level 1, and there are extra options.
Great, thanks. Chris, anything to add on that?
I agree. And the situation is the same in the UK. We don't have quite the same idea of MUDs, but we also have private housing that does not have driveways. And then the question is, how do they charge? And I think more slower charging that is kind on the grid, is cheap to operate, is a great solution, particularly in those areas where we want a just transition, an equitable transition, rather than just those that happen to have off-street parking being able to charge cheaper, and those who have to charge publicly perhaps less likely even to own an EV, and if they do, then paying more. So I just echo the panelists' comments.
Great, thanks to all of you. We also had a question in the chat, and it started, I think, with you, Mary, in your presentation, but a reference to hydrogen and just sort of the viability of that, and just so if any of you have any sort of quick off the top of your head thoughts on how hydrogen infrastructure plays into all of this. And I guess I'll start with you, Mary, since the question was initially directed at you.
Okay, well, so let me just talk about what we're actually doing in our hydrogen follow-on study for TINA, and that is to sort of be agnostic about whether we're going to get a significant penetration of hydrogen or not, but just assume somewhere between 5 and 10% penetration is achieved across all use cases, so medium and heavy duty as well as light duty, by 2035, and just try and say, okay, if we were to, of the ZEVs that we expect, if they were to be fueled by hydrogen by 2035, what would it take? What kind of infrastructure would we need? So we just want to get, again, we're trying to do a needs analysis and kind of get a big picture overview. And I'll let other panelists address the appropriateness of hydrogen in different use cases.
Yeah, we're running up on time here, but Matteo or Chris, if you have quick thoughts on hydrogen, please throw in as well.
Not for light duty, maybe for heavy duty, only if environmentally sourced.
Yeah,
Matteo, anything else?
That's aligned with what we're seeing. We see a great opportunity for hydrogen to support heavy-duty vehicles, especially the long-haul vehicles that are going to be significantly harder to electrify. I think vehicles that need 700, 800, 900 miles of range to complete their mission and to support the application that they do support today. And so that would be a really good application for hydrogen in our mind. As well as applications in other modes. I mean, today we focus a lot of on-road, but transportation is a lot more than that. There are rails, there are ships, there are airplanes. Hydrogen can also be a great intermediate for clean fuels for those applications. And there is not only transportation, right? There is heavy industry, steel production, cement. There is a lot of energy needed where we think hydrogen can really make big contributions, supporting the grid, supporting seasonal energy storage, for example. So a lot of applications. I think we should really think of hydrogen as only a transportation fuel or only a fuel for fuel cell vehicles. Is a lot more than that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matteo and Mary and Chris. Great conversation today. Really appreciate you being here, and I will kick it back over to Simbi. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. We have one more poll question for you all on how informative did you find this webinar as we do our closeout for the webinar today. I want to say thank you so much to our amazing moderator, Rhett. Thank you to our panelists, Chris, Matteo, and Mary for joining us and speaking to us today and sharing your insights and your knowledge with our attendees today. Thank you to our sponsors, PGE, Portland General Electric, BMW, and Black & Veatch for the support. Thank you all for spending, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, or your evening with us to learn about the charging infrastructure ecosystem. We didn't get through all of the questions today, but we will be following up with the webinar recap, presentations, recording, and a webinar and some webinar additional resources to help continue and further the conversation. So if you missed anything, you're not really missing anything because we will share everything with you all. If you want to get a hold of our speakers, their information is here, but it will also be in the webinar recap. We hope in 2 weeks you can join us for Addressing Anti-Displacement and Gentrification in Transportation Electrification, Tuesday, October 26th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. The webinar will be focused on building equitable community leadership to address anti-displacement strategies and to accelerate the clean transportation industry. If you would like to know more information about that, we will be sharing that as well in our webinar recap. And we won't hold you for too much longer. We just want to say we appreciate you. And if you have any suggestions for topics we should be covering, we want to make sure we're covering those emerging topics. You can send those to me. My email will also be in the webinar recap. Thank you all for joining us this Tuesday, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.